So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Richmond Art Gallery's panel discussion on the artwork of Theodore Wan. My name is Kathy Tykolis. I'm the Richmond Art Gallery's Education Public Programs Coordinator, and I'm here to introduce our program today and to help moderate your questions. Our panel will be hosted by Michael Dang, our guest curator of the current exhibition at the Richmond Art Gallery, Unit Bruises, Theodore Wan and Paul Wong, 1975 to 1979. And he will be joined by artists Christos Dikeakos and Paul Hess, along with curator and writer Christine Conley, who all knew Theodore Wan at different stages of his career. So I will introduce everyone, take care of some housekeeping first, and then we can start our discussion tonight. So first, on behalf of the Richmond Art Gallery Association, I would like to welcome you all to this program, which is hosted by the Richmond Art Gallery, which is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Hunkaminam speaking peoples, which are the nations that live all along and up and down the Fraser River Delta, including the Musqueam. And I would like to thank everyone out there for joining us from here and far. Thank you to Christine and Paul, who are coming to us from the East Coast, Ontario coast area. And then all of you from wherever you're zooming in from, thank you for joining us and supporting the Richmond Art Gallery's programs. So guest curator and tonight's host, Michael Dang. Michael is a curator, filmmaker, writer, and MA candidate in the Critical and Curatorial Studies program at the University of British Columbia, where he also received his BA degree majoring in art history. Dang was a recipient of the SSHRC Canada Graduate Scholarship Masters Award in September 2022, and the Audain Foundation Graduate Fellowship of that same year. His curatorial practice is research and archival based, with a special interest in historical curation and socio-political contextualization, broadly focusing on mid-century conceptualism. He is based in Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. Welcome, Michael. Christine Conley, PhD, is an Ottawa-based art historian and curator with a long-term interest in issues of gender, cultural difference, and armed conflict. She curated the exhibition Theodore Wan with Dalhousie University Art Gallery in 2003 in Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver. The International Performance Art Exchange Crossings in 2010 with the Belfast collective Bbeyond and Indigenous Canadian artists in Belfast and Ottawa. In terms of engagement, Averns, feldman-kiss, Stimson in 2014 with artists in the Canadian Forces Artist Program in Halifax, Kingston, and Calgary. Book chapters and journal essays include Joyce Wieland, Christiana Pflug, Mary Kelly, Rebecca Belmore, Faye HeavyShield, Maria Hupfield, Charlotte Salomon, Jeff Wall, and Pien and May Chan. Welcome, Christine, tonight.
Thanks.
And we have Christos Dikeakos. Since the late 60s to the mid 70s, Christos' photographic practice has played an important role in the development of conceptual photography in Vancouver. His 80s and 90s photographic projects, Sites and Place Names, works of Vancouver, Saskatoon, Athens, and Berlin, engage in the memories, histories, and urban typologies within contemporary urban habitations. More recently, Dikeakos has produced a traveling exhibition for the McMaster Museum of Art, which combines drawing, collage, sculpture, and photography, unpacking a 40-year work and thoughts on French-American artist Marcel Duchamp. His most recent exhibition in 2023 was a retrospective held at the Museum of Photography in his birth city of Thessaloniki, Greece. Christos Dikeakos currently lives and works in Vancouver, British Columbia. Welcome, Christos.
Thanks.
Last but not least, Paul Hess was born in Toronto, Ontario in 1954. He studied at the University of Guelph and completed his Master of Fine Arts from NSCAD, the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, in 1978. Hess has been exhibiting his paintings and photographs across Canada since 1974. He has been the recipient of arts grants from the Ontario Arts Council, BC Arts Council, and the Canada Council. He has taught at several universities from across Canada. From 1987 to 2008, he was an associate professor and dean of media arts at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. And in 2008, Hess was appointed director of the School of Art at the University of Manitoba, and he currently maintains studios in Vancouver and Niagara-on-the-Lake. So welcome tonight, Paul.
Thank you.
So I will now hand this over to Michael Dang, our guest curator, to host. I will fade into the background to moderate the questions. So again, feel free to send those in at any time throughout the talk tonight. And then maybe I'll come back up through the Q&A. Right? Thanks, everyone. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for that great introduction. And thank you so much, Melanie, for backup and everybody else at the RAG staff for being so helpful, and also so for help to facilitate this exhibition. It was been such a great joy to work on this exhibition at the Richmond Art Gallery. Thank you so much to Christine and Christos and Paul for being part of this panel with me. One of the things that I wanted to do with this show was to because for those of you who don't know Theodore, specifically in the late 70s, he was very interested in medical photography and surgical diagrams, and because he passed away so young at the age of 33 in 1987, you know, much of the focus and much of the interpretation around his work has often been through that sort of like eerie or sort of morbid lens. But one of the things I wanted to do with this exhibition and with this panel is to sort of uh, put that attention onto Theodore during his life, his sense of humor and his sort of personality and who he is personally. And we have a couple people here on the panel here today, and also in the attendees audience. I won't say who, but who actually knew Theodore personally and can sort of speak to that. So for our three panelists, I was wondering, yeah, how did we can this can be sort of a free flowing and an organic conversation. And oh yeah, also important to mention, our exhibition closes on June 30th, which is this Sunday. So this is kind of like a farewell sort of like closing event for our show. But it's also Theodore's birthday coming up on June 29th in 2 days from now. So I like to think of it as a sort of, Theodore birthday kind of celebration as well. So yeah, for everyone on my screen, I think I have Christine first. And if we sort of talk about sort of the sub art gallery, I can pull up my PowerPoint here. But let's go, yeah, sort of individually. And how did everyone meet Theodore? I think Christine, then,
Should
yeah.
go first.
Yeah.
Okay. I met Theodore because I was working at the Sub Art Gallery at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. It was 1982. And I'll be telling you about these works in just a sec, actually. Um, and Theodore had a wonderful exhibition there with Susie Lake. It was called Wan Lake. And afterwards, that exhibition traveled on and it went to the ACA Gallery in Calgary, where a disaster struck. There was some flooding. I think there was heavy rains or something. His work was irreparably damaged. And it was, I think, mere days, like a few days before the opening. And so he had to reprint the entire or most of the exhibition. But he couldn't afford to send dry mounted works by air, in time. Um, and I also um, worth noting at this time, the gallery was not insured for his artwork because it wasn't in frames. So, there's that kind of expectation that an artist always puts their work in a frame, right, at the time. So what he did is he reprinted the works and laminated them, which made them very light. And then he was able to ship them at a lower cost. And they made it and they were there for the show and all was fine. But afterwards, when the damaged work came back to the gallery, Theodore sent us instructions saying that we needed to destroy all of it and document the fact that we destroyed it. So there's three photos to see there. One of them is these pieces of his photographs. And the letter that you see on the left was signed by myself and the two other employees, Greg Pace and Jane Pirani, um, we had all destroyed the work together, and this is certifying it as such. And then the next slide, the next image is an image of us destroying the work. And we had these hard hats from a different gallery project. And so we kind of hammed it up, I guess. So instead of letting himself get really frustrated by this whole process and everything, basically it turned into another performance. to destroy these pieces. And it actually was a difficult thing to do, to destroy somebody's artwork in that way. So that's what that is about. So that's how I first met Theodore, was in that situation.
Wow.
Christos can go next. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I knew him, and he was a junior to me at the University of British Columbia as a BFA student, and he was a very good friend of my sister Alexandra, Dikeakos, Barry Jones. These were all students that BFA students, which was more or less a new kind of direction away from art history, of which I was, of course, in art history. And he was known as Mr. Normal at that time. And Mr. Normal had this kind of facade that he used in many kind of occasions as what I thought of, is this person really going to become an artist or not? You know, just because he had that incredible straight appearance, he did not have long hair. He was well coiffed. He sometimes wore a jacket and slacks, always with the camera. And I knew him as a kind of a straight, kind of knowledgeable photographer. But he seemed to be, and for me, he was an inaccessible, nerdy guy. You know, that's the way it came to, because I didn't socialize with him. I wasn't in class with him. So at the same time, I knew that he was well trained by Fred Herzog, of which I'm sure a lot of you out there know who he is. He's one of the great photographers of this country. And not only was he well trained by Fred, but he also, in terms of technical expertise, of which Fred was absolutely paramount, but at the same time, he also learned street photography, which was very, very different from the kind of side jobs he was doing, which was photographing, let's say, people at the very famous nude beach at close to the university, groups and all those kind of activities. But what was I going to say about that? He also, I kind of saw him as he leaves as a well-trained photographer, and then comes back when I re-engage with him in the 80s in a very different way as an artist who uses photography. You know, that was kind of the big difference, you know, and whatever those 9 years or 8 years difference was, it didn't matter anymore, especially when you get older, right? Yeah. So that's my little story.
Yeah, thank you, Christos. We can go
Yeah.
on to Paul now.
Yeah.
Well, I met Theodore when I went out to Halifax to join the MFA program, which was at that point that was late fall of 1976. So Theodore was half a year ahead of me in the program, and so at the beginning of that, what normally happened with the graduate students is that every week they would meet in what we called the graduate seminar, not an adventurous name, but it was a weekly gathering to discuss all kinds of things. Some of those topics were organized by the head of the program who ran the seminar, and then or sometimes we would invent subjects or things that we wanted to discuss. And so the program was not large. I mean, it had mostly American students. It was when the majority of the faculty and the majority of the students at the school were Americans. A lot of them from the Northeast, because the school was very proximal to places like Maine, Massachusetts, New York State, so on, so forth. But when I started, they were starting to trying to get comfortable with the idea of Canadian students coming in the graduate program. So there weren't a lot. And I was one of I think the third or the fourth Canadian that joined the program. I think they were not sure about people in the rest of the country. So there were several of us. Theodore was obviously one of the first ones as well. So we met every week, and Theodore at that point I didn't really have much to do with him. He was involved in photography projects, so he was in a part of the school that was quite different than where my studio was. We were put in with mostly the studio practitioners, whereas Theodore was hanging around in the darkroom areas, which are in another building. But what happened later in that year is that I decided I needed to live in a different place, and we ran into each other at some point in the summer. And he said, "Well, I just took this apartment at Hollis, the corner of Hollis and Morris Street. It used to be rented by two of the American students, Jim Schäufele and Andre Strong." And so he said, "Do you want to room with me? And then we'll find one other person, and because it's got 3 bedrooms and it's a kind of a funky place." So we moved into this old, really ramshackle gray 3-story building. And so that was my I guess we became not joined at the hip, but we were tied together because we were living in this apartment, which was about a 15-minute walk from the school. So we started to share all kinds of things, conversations, interests in art, and different art references. We got to know each other quite well. And so we had this great apartment, and then we were working at the school. And so then I was able to connect a lot more with Ted, and that's what we called him at the time. It was Ted. And so that was when I first got to know Ted in a much more interesting and much more engaging way. The first couple of months during the seminar, he was very quiet. He didn't talk a lot, for whatever reasons that I don't know about. But then I stayed in the apartment until I graduated, which was in '78, and then I came back that summer to teach, and then I taught in 1980 as well, and that was the last time I stayed in the apartment. By that point, Ted was gone, but Roy Hartling was living he took over the apartment, and so I stayed that one summer. I went back in '82 as well to teach, but I was living somewhere else in the city because the apartment by then was somebody else had the apartment. And then sadly, when I began my tenure at University of Manitoba, David McWilliam and I ran into each other walking up towards Coburg Road, where the CAFAD, which is the annual Dean's Conference, was taking place at Dalhousie. And we walked up to the fence, to a fence that was at the Coburg Road building, and all it was a huge deep hole in the ground, which was the original art school back in the day on Coburg Road, which had just been razed below ground, just took everything out because they were redeveloping the property. And then after that first day, I walked down to the old neighborhood to see what was going on. And the Hollis and Morris building was a huge development sign. So they were about to raise that building as well. And so the whole thing was going through a gentrification. So, I mean, it was kind of like a full cycle of taking things on. But I'd like to, there will be other opportunities to talk more, I'm sure, about a few things related to all that. But so I got to know Theodore really well when he and I were staying at that apartment, and had a lot of really neat experiences and really interesting experience and discussions. So I'll try to elaborate on some of that during the presentations as well, if I can.
Well, yes, thank you, you three, for those brilliant sort of answers. It also seems kind of very interesting to me that, I'm talking with you three, and you seem to have all known him at sort of these different points in his life, Like Christos had known him a little bit sort of in his mid-70s when he was getting his BFA, and then a little bit more in the 80s, and then Christine, you had met him in around 1982 during the Sub Art Gallery days, and Paul, you really knew him the most during the sort of the NASCAD days.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in sort of bringing up and talking this question about personality and demeanor in a lot of ways, because you know, from our conversations I've had with the three of you, he was known to be, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, a person who was kind of quiet and reserved in a lot of ways, but we know Christos brought up the notion of Mr. Normal as this sort of persona or this character that he brought up. And so I was wondering for each of you, and anyone can sort of start first, what are your memories of his personality and his demeanor, and what are some of your fondest memories, perhaps?
I'll start
Oh.
on that. I think when you asked the question, how do you recall Theodore at Sub Art Gallery? I remembered this other story, but when I don't have quite the sharpest memories of that earlier time, and I think that partly was his reserve. It wasn't that he didn't say anything at all, of course, but he was very circumspect, and he didn't discuss his work at great lengths unless you actually asked him particular questions. I do remember the summer of 1982, after that exhibition, Joan Borsa, who was the director at the gallery, we went to Vancouver to a conference, and Theodore picked us up at the airport, and he took us to the Van Dusen Botanical Gardens to stroll around, and that was all very lovely. But the strange thing was that he asked me to name the plants, and he seemed to think that because I'd been living in Britain recently, and I was probably still wearing some pretty frumpy clothes from that period, that somehow I was British and therefore I would know the names of everything, right? And this is all has to do with, you know, Hong Kong and being a colony and so forth. So that was one kind of fun memory. And after that, actually, the three of us went on a trip to Seattle with Theodore, where he took pictures of us with this little tiny camera, and I've forgotten the name of it.
Minox.
What is it called?
It's a Minox, a little Minox.
A Minox, right?
Yeah.
Just a tiny thing you wear around a chain, you can hide it. And he was really thrilled with this thing because he could just take these little pictures and nobody would know, which in my case is good because I'm very self-conscious in front of the camera. But that typified him because he was fascinated by photography. He was really passionate about it. And in fact, I got my first camera, my first decent one from him. He used to sell cameras at London Drugs, and he got this camera and sent it to him for me. At a later visit that summer alone, he invited me to stay with his family. So I stayed at their home, which was very generous of them. And on the weekend, I went with his family for dim sum. And it was really interesting. I'd never had almond milk before. It wasn't everywhere in the grocery stores the way it is today. Overall, a really nice experience. I was gratified that I knew how to use chopsticks already, fortunately. But so I wasn't too embarrassed, but I was learning a lot. This was not the kind of food I would see in Chinese restaurants in Ottawa or Toronto even. Yeah. Another thing is Theodore told me the Chinese characters to look for on restaurant signs to know that the food was really good so that I wouldn't be disappointed. He was a foodie. He was, but when I say foodie, I mean he was very exacting. He believed in, you know, the old recipes and so on, and was a great cook too. So I remember all of those things about first meeting him. Yeah, that's. I guess that's.
I'd like to add to what you're saying, Christine, about his generosity and also his conviviality. You know, by the 80s, I see him as generous, convivial, and not the kind of artist pals where there's an ego involved, there's competition. I did that, earlier than you, whatever. That was never there. That was always, he would not do any of that. And the other thing about him, that generosity was very important to our city and to a lot of up and coming artists, and also I remember mature artists who have just completed their BFA, and he would allow them to do an exhibition at the main exit gallery, which was actually his studio at the top floor of a 1920s BC Electric Tram Company building. It's a historic building. And in fact, the name main exit is, you can still go over the Georgia Viaduct, and it says main exit this way. That sign is still there, and there's the building right next to it. And he paid a very inexpensive rent because he knew the Hong Kong owners, and they trusted him to bring in good clients. You know, there was a silkscreen shop, there were artists, studios, and of course, he made sure they all paid the rent. And that kind of generosity on his part is that he would allow exhibitions where, without any bureaucracy, without any curatorial kind of, you know, critique or whatever, he would just look at it, he would have a conversation, and they would happen without of what's happened now everywhere, whether it's parallel gallery or private gallery. You have to go through a whole bureaucratic system, and that was refreshing. So you could tell, you know, that all that diffidence, all that kind of complex, what I thought was standoffish, was this incredible generosity, you know, this offering, and so he was really involved in the community in so many ways, especially when we really needed it in those, you know, those early 80s here in Vancouver. Yeah.
Well, as I said, when I started at the program, he was kind of in the background in a certain way because he kept to himself a little bit more. He wasn't super talkative in the seminars. He was a good listener. He was always like right there, but he was not one of the outspoken, extroverted like there were several in the program. But when we started life in the apartment, I got to know him a lot better and realized he was meticulous, an absolutely meticulous person in his approach to most things. He was a very stylish dresser. He had magazines that he kept in his bedroom, stacks of these not fashion magazines, but like real European magazines devoted to you know high style clothing. He was always wearing really good shirts and dressed really well. He's very conscious of how he projected his image. His deportment was very elegant and very considered. His personal care, his dress, all that was very well attended to, and he never let that down. He didn't show up in Converse running shoes and denim. I don't think he owned a pair of jeans ever as long as I knew him. Because he's always dressed at a much higher level, and so he was projecting himself in a very different way than a lot of people that we knew, and he certainly didn't resemble the train of visual artists that came in who were dressing, in monochrome colors and taking kind of a low thing. He was very conscious of himself in that way, but he really liked to laugh and he liked to joke around. He had a really soft side to him, and he could laugh really hard at a lot of good stuff. So we were kind of provoking each other into funny situations a lot, just to lighten it all up. But he was a great cook, and he was willing to share lots of skills and histories of that. He was very thoughtful with regard to his family. And when I first made my first trip out to teach in Vancouver in '79, he invited me out to his mom's place and his place, and we had a nice evening there, and it was really nice to meet his brother Winston and all that. And so he was, and then after that, as you mentioned, he started Main Exit, and so he kept me he kept sending me stuff about all that. So he kept in touch, which was great. He was a very skillful person. He had lots of interests personally. He spent a lot of time quietly working in his room in the apartment. He spent long hours in there. We all, often wondered, what is he up to? Because he's so quiet. He wasn't playing loud music or any of that sort of stuff or banging around, but he was thoughtfully considering a lot of stuff that he was thinking about and working on. He kind of kept his cards close. He wasn't, we've heard, he wasn't an extroverted braggart. He wasn't braggy at all. He wasn't overbearing in his talking about his work. So, but he was willing to talk. And I think, Christine, you mentioned if you asked him questions, he would. And so I would always ask him questions. What do you think about this? Or what about this artist or that artist? And then we would get into these conversations about who he was reading about that week, or, what was interesting to him. Or he would relate a story about being somewhere in New York or in Vancouver, and he would talk about it. So he opened up a lot that way. He did like talking about his ideas and artists and art references that he was interested in, but initially he needed to, he didn't start those conversations sometimes. He did need to be drawn out, but he had no problems carrying his weight in a place like NASCAD, where everybody was kind of in the spotlight and everybody needed to perform it in a sense at a certain level. But I always sensed that he was performing in private in a certain way. It was like a kind of a way of understanding, where he was always actively thinking about what he was doing, and he was always actively engaged in him from his own point of view. But he wasn't necessarily extroverted to the point where that spilled out all the time. So he became a very interesting person to have as a friend, or as a colleague, as a graduate student, because he was interesting. He had lots of things to say and lots of interests. He just needed to be drawn out. And that meticulous approach carried him very far, I think. Because and the other side of him was that he was very interested in pursuing things that interested him. So he quietly went about his business in a very intense way as well. So he was a complex person with a lot of interesting characteristics. He wasn't wearing his personality on the outside. He was constructing it and creating it and modifying it and living with it on the inside, I think, a lot.
Paul, if you don't mind, I know, if you don't mind me sort of looping back to you, I think it's there's a lot of things that everybody said that really, sort of stood out to me, and I would like to sort of know more about. But I was wondering, Paul, specifically, if you could talk about specifically the sort of the student and the work culture at NASCAD at the time, and specifically what drew you to NASCAD. Did you get a sense of what drew Theodore to NASCAD? And you were talking about how you talked to him about these, sort of ideas and sort of his ideas and opinions on artwork, but you had to sort of get it out of him. And what do you remember? Do you remember very much from those conversations?
Well, there were a number of things that were interesting. He didn't want to talk a lot about his technical prowess in photography. He was a really good photographer. He had a great sense of timing. He had the street photographer's sense of where to look, where to point the camera. He had great technical skills with that strategy, if I can use that word. I'll loop back to that word again, because that's that kind of a NASCAD word in a way. And then when he was doing the slow work with the 4x5, I mean, it was again, even though he may have had, he needed some assistance because it's not a simple thing to operate. He was always, he had people around him to help when necessary. I think that the challenge at NASCAD when I arrived was that the place had established itself historically as one of the most important schools in North America, if not the world. Les Levine in 1973 wrote an article in Art in America saying, NASCAD, is it the best art school in North America? And he kind of provoked that, and the school took that and ran with it. Suddenly the school had in some ways been exposed to the world, and so the visiting artist program at the time was basically a faculty salary devoted to bringing people in. they came up from New York and from different parts of the US, sometimes from the West Coast, but it was very inexpensive to fly up to Halifax from New York. So a lot of people came through that route. They didn't just come and give a talk and disappear. They often hung around for a week, had meetings with faculty, had meetings with Gary and Jerry, and so on. So there was a lot of activity that way. The pressure was on the graduate students more than the undergraduate students. There were a lot of different kinds of things. It was at the, and the reason I mentioned the Les Levine article in the history of the school is because that was what drew attention to it. I mean, for me, I was studying at the University of Guelph, and which was a good, very traditional kind of Midwest school. Development, most of it was figuratively driven, drawing. It was very competent retrograde sort of style of work, but I had no interest in that. I had quit school when I was a late high school student and read every book in the art section in the public library out of Toronto, and I had different ideas in my head at that point, and I was ready to quit. And so I went to one of the faculty members and said, I think I'm going to quit. I want to go to this place in Halifax, because I got a catalog of their syllabus, and it said there was a seminar on the art of Marcel Duchamp. And I said, I have to go there because I want to go to, and I want to participate in that seminar. So for me, that was kind of an awakening of NASCAD. When I got there, I realized that there was challenges that were complex. I mean, it had been that conceptual school, but a number of faculty had been hired a couple of years earlier, and they had not been involved in that conceptual school. They were coming from a different point of view that wanted to return to more traditional things. I mean, so painting was starting to come back and drawing was starting to come back at that time in the mid-late 70s. And because the graduate students were able to go to the faculty meetings, there began to be a debate which ended up being quite polarized between the conceptual members of the faculty who had fought hard to establish all those new ways of doing things, and these younger upstarts who said, no, we're interested in painting, for example, and we want to show people what the value of painting. There's lots that can be done in there. So it pulled the school apart, and it made it very complicated for everybody. So it was tense. You were always felt that you were being tested and observed. The undergraduates had a lot more fun. They had more parties and had more fun. We had really good parties when we had them, but there were, the faculty would come in the apartment especially, and people like Benjamin Buchla would show up. And that was the other thing that happened. When Benjamin showed up to run the press, he brought with him a vast knowledge of European conceptual art and practices, and he taught a course on contemporary art. And so what happened was nobody knew anything about the people he was talking about. So suddenly in the back row, we were all sitting up there in the back row when he did these talks, because we were trying to figure out, who's he talking about and who are these people, and what are they doing? What is this work they're doing? It's even more bizarre than, and interesting than the stuff coming out of New York was. And then faculty started showing up. So it was like Benjamin was teaching people about what was going on in Europe post-war to the present. And so that really also put a dent in it. And feminism started at the school during that tenure of mine as I began my MFA studies. So there were lots of these different kinds of energies that were mashing together and trying to find a place. And Gary and Jerry started, they had been running this school since 1968 and made it into what it was. And so suddenly there were these other people in the school that were trying to change some of the culture, and the students seemed to be interested in it. So it's created a whole series of not abrasive contacts, but you just had to be aware of these debates. You had to learn how to negotiate them and so on. And so I think it had effect on the graduate school, because when I started, I was the only one who was actually interested in producing paintings under a kind of a conceptual framework. Everybody else was doing work that had nothing to do with any traditional art practices. They were doing a lot of photography, or they were doing text-based works. It was very, very much of, the zeitgeist of that very moment. There was no lag between what was going on in New York or Europe what was going on in the studios at NASCAD. It was almost simultaneous. So that was the milieu, that was the context. And Theodore, I think, was able to figure that out at a certain point. And he chose a combination of interesting things to put together this ready-made strategy where he became the subject and placed himself in these situations which were complex and yet done very elegantly and very carefully and very beautifully. And so that, I think, gave him some individuality in an environment which was shifting and changing, but he really stood out for that work when it was being created around all those other things that were going on.
Thank you. Yeah, so much for that. And actually, we have a question in the Q&A right now from David McWilliam. Hi, David. David, also a friend of Theodore as well. So shout out to David. And this sort of ties into actually what Christos was saying in the beginning about how, when he left for NASCAD, he was a photographer. But when he came back from NASCAD, he was an artist who used photography. And David asks, there seems to be a big shift in Theodore's work from what he did as an undergraduate student at UBC to his move at NASCAD. And do you have any sense of sort of what drew him to conceptual photography? And this can be for, Christos or for Christine.
Well, I think conceptualism was a kind of central, I would say, central ethos at NASCAD at that time. Conceptualism was, I mean, it was fading because, as Paul's pointed out, that painting was now emerging once again as something of interest. But I think that Theodore's work has a lot in common with other conceptual artists who were trying to navigate a milieu that was very much about male artists and very much about male artists of European background, whether they were Canadian or American. And there were people like Mary Kelly in particular, who were working in this critical way that conceptual art advanced, that separated out, the artist doing conceptual work from this vision of the artist that was associated, say, most spectacularly with abstract expressionism, but also was in other forms of art too, that it's all about the artist's emotions and biography and all of these things. And so conceptualism did intervene in that in ways that were actually very productive, but institutionally they tended to still only apply or advance the careers of male artists. And so someone like Mary Kelly, for instance, who does a feminist analysis of that and brings forward her postpartum document, which was absolutely shocking at the time, and she was pilloried for it and dismissed and so on, is one really good example of using the procedures and approach of conceptual art in a way that lends subjectivity to a woman artist, therefore someone who is kind of excluded from that process as it actually works out. And for Theodore, I think it provided structures for him to, and as did medical photography specifically, it provided this structure for him to present himself as a subject in process, as it were, as well as someone who is going through some kind of crisis, specifically in the works that Michael, you have put in the exhibition, because those ones are the most, are the ones where you feel most acutely this sense of real anxiety and persecution even. So maybe I've probably said enough about that, but that's how I kind of see how NASCAD provided something really valuable for him in terms of conceptualism. And at the same time, I think he was working something out. I don't know if it was ever really acknowledged by those who really had the clout at NASCAD. I don't know if they ever really understood what he was doing in the medical photography at all. And maybe Paul could speak to that.
Well, yeah, I think there was a sense that he was out there and like in a certain way because of the strict use of the medical illustrations. I think everybody acknowledged that he was technically proficient, and so they granted him like the skill sets that you would, that would kind of follow the quality of the work. But because he was reticent, and I mean, sometimes I would prod him about talking about his work at the apartment when we were just sitting around talking variously. And he would want to talk about it, but he wouldn't give you all the information. So I mean, I think he spent a lot of time trying to.
Oh, Paul, excuse me. Sorry. There's just like some static on your mic a little bit.
Oh, okay, sorry. Oh, okay. At this point, can you?
Yeah, there was a bit for a second there.
Okay.
But yeah.
No
worries.
I think that he probably couldn't have done that work if he had not gone to NASCAD and sort of surveyed what was going on there and tried to figure out where he was in that milieu. I also wonder, because of his background with Fred Herzog, who worked at UBC and was involved in medical illustration. I wondered if there was any kind of something that clicked for him with that, if he pieced that together with his own interests, with the Duchampian, the ready-made interest. Because I think that the ready-made aspect of some of that work, especially when he was able to put the exhibit together at eye level, I guess, or was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was eye level, wasn't it? And then it was at the hospital.
Yeah.
Oh no, that was that Center
for Art Tapes.
Center for Art Tapes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So like,
not David.
That was a real moment of bringing it all together.
In 1970.
Yeah, and I think that was he couldn't have done that if he had stayed in Vancouver. I don't think. I think he would have found something different to do. But I think that's true, that the observation that he was a very good photographer, because I know I did work with some of that work with the Rec Beach stuff and saw a lot of his street photography, and it was extremely competent. But it was very distant. I mean, he was very detached from the subject matter in both bodies of work. And whereas this is like, he actually was able to now confront the camera. He was putting himself into the image. And that was a huge leap forward for him. And I think that really changed it all. Gave him the confidence to do more work like that. And then to start working with some of the works where he leading towards the final piece, and I think that was something that was really significant. And I agree with a lot of the ways in which I think it's true. A lot of the observations that you made, Christine, are quite valid in the context and I think that in some ways it is a gendered problematic, if I can put it that way. The conceptual thing at NASCAD was also curious because you had to find ways to eliminate words like mistakes from your vocabulary. There were no such things as mistakes. That's why I use the word prescriptive, because you planned it out before you made it. You allowed for a certain thing to happen. There were some variables that weren't accountable for. But you worked the bugs out of it before you executed it. And I think for Theodore, the kind of person he was very good at doing that. He could actually generate that image with quite a lot of skill and finesse. And that's really different when you turn the camera around and point it at yourself and then put yourself within an apparatus at the same time. That's really different than going out and anonymously using a small format camera to sneak photographs on the street. So that's not the environment. The camera is pointing at you, and I think that's quite substantially different. So maybe that does sort of point out how David's observation about being a photographer and coming back as an artist really was a significant moment for him, and the catharsis that must have provoked that, though we probably never know the exact origins of something like that. might be a conflation of some of the things from Vancouver and his skill and these kinds of crises that you were describing.
Thank you so much for that. And I just want to ask Christos a question before we head to the Q&A, because I know that, there's another question that pops up in the Q&A. But Christos, I was very specifically interested in asking you, because you and Theodore were very close friends. I know that you were involved with the sort of the donation of the sort of the art section of his estate to the Vancouver Art Gallery, or you were like part of that decision. And yeah, I wanted to get more of a sense from you. This is kind of a two-pronged question. First, a little bit of more of a sense of kind of like your close friendship with him. And I was also very interested because we've been talking a lot about sort of the NASCAD era of Theodore quite a bit. But it seems to me like, even when he studied at NASCAD for 2 years, he would always come back and forth to Vancouver via Greyhound bus, and he seemed to have his roots here in a lot of ways. He seemed to identify with Vancouver. And I want to know more about that and his sort of commitments to and his sort of passion about the communities around Vancouver.
Yeah. It's interesting that conceptual art was really the last avant-garde. And it only had a very short lifespan. Like the patient died, but we learned so much after the autopsy about what conceptual art is, its methodologies, its objective stance, all these, maybe a lot of its critical sensibilities. And the other thing that we both realized in our conversations, but it really didn't have much value in terms of becoming an artist and making conceptual art, making a living, unless you're in the Golden Triangle of New York or LA or somewhere else. And that was also the same for artists like, Terry Atkinson, who's a good friend of mine. At some point, you let it go. And then you start to reconsider what you left, and then you pick up on it. The one thing about Theodore that I remember very clearly was that he knew that he was a Canadian artist from the Hong Kong diaspora, and he was very proud of that. He also trained 2 or 3 photographers from the Hong Kong diaspora at his studio and taught him, they basically taught them their profession. So he was not, he still had that connection. And I know that, Christine, you talked about that earlier. And that heritage, and Christine talked about cooking and knowing the recipes and all that. Well, he would treat us, a number of us would go out. He would invite a number of artists to a special dinner somewhere in a kind of a most unlikely place that you've never heard of. It wasn't necessarily in Chinatown either. It was somewhere maybe around Nanaimo Street or, way out there. And he would organize these very casual dinners based on what we should eat at that particular season and what was in season. And it would be an elaborate 10-course dinner. And it wouldn't necessarily end with rice. So that was the kind of thing that, okay, you knew him as an artist, but then you also knew him as a kind of a serious bon vivant, social host on such occasions. And that's when he was, of course, very convivial, very sociable, and art at that particular point was not really discussed. There's not much discussion. When he comes back to Vancouver, he helped me a lot with a solo show that I had at the Vancouver Art Gallery, because what I was doing is I do this, even today I do this, I'll take pictures, photographer, but I also like to manipulate those pictures. I like to get ready-made pictures and collage and photo collage and actually rearrange those kind of realities. I kind of do that all the time. And this was an exhibition that I got the green light to do as a solo show. So we spent a month or two photographing these very small kind of collages and then trying to figure out how we can blow them up to absolute maximum size. And then what I wanted to do with them, what kind of reflective substances were there. So at that point, we really got fairly close in terms of how I knew he was working and how he could also comment on the kind of interest that I had. Now, at the same time, he had quite a few jobs. He worked at his family's funeral business. He was also a consummate, he was a salesman, a photographer on the very edgy and kind of sketchy downtown east side, which has actually just gotten worse in Vancouver. And he really kind of made a stakehold in the kind of nightclub entertainment district, especially with the strippers, with that whole kind of entertainment milieu. And he photographed for hire for several of the strippers who required, I would say, kind of salacious and sexual revealing photography for their own profession. And at the same time, I remember him counseling them and telling them to hang on to their money, not to get hung up in the drug trade, and get out of this thing. So he, of course, could walk into those places all the way into the dressing room, and all, no matter how people were dressed or whatever, he was always welcome. So again, it's like wearing all these different hats. And both Christine and Paul talked about the complexity. Well, the complexities really started to play out in the topography of Vancouver's nightlife, and also art scene. And that was quite something. The one thing that was a stumbling block for him, because of course he's totally into this flesh scene, nightclubs, the whole thing, and the nude client photography, he really wanted to do something with that. And I think I mentioned it also to Christine, and he wanted to turn the paradox of pornographic art into something else. Could he actually do it? Question if it was possible, drive that subject into something else through photography, and especially with the representation of the nude female body. And it became a stumbling block for him. And it was unfortunate he wasn't given enough lifetime to figure it out. It's just one of those kind of things.
Yeah. We are kind of running a bit overtime, but we do have some questions in the chat.
Okay.
I hope it's okay for everybody in
Yeah.
the panel just to stay on for a few more minutes. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for your time and all
Yeah.
of your wonderful thoughts.
Yeah.
So Brandon has sort of a comment and a question. The first is a comment that I think I'm going to tie into Anton's question a little bit. Brandon's comment is that Theodore's work reminds him of the photographic artist Sang Kwang Chi, whose photographs also dealt with identity, self-portraiture, and conceptualism. I read he also passed through Vancouver and UBC briefly when his family was moving around. And actually Muna Sieng, sorry if I didn't pronounce that name right, but who I think was actually a prof at UBC, and she's like a dancer, that sort of idea.
Mm-hmm.
To tie into Anton's question, Anton was wondering, to his knowledge, Wan had also made works in the Gulf Islands, like Hornby Island.
Yes.
And I wonder if anyone in the panel has some knowledge of Wan's relationship to the islands in BC specifically and their art communities.
Yeah.
And
Well,
Christine, oh, sorry. No, sorry,
yeah,
Christos, but I
sorry.
think,
Just in terms of making a work at Hornby, well, of course, one of his teachers, Tom Burrows, lived in Hornby and had a home in Hornby. Also, there are a number of artists that lived in Down and still live in Downs Point, so he was welcome to do a kind of a performance video work there. I think that was a kind of a safe entree for him to actually do that almost controversial work there. Yeah.
I think, yeah, Christine, I think in your introductory essay for the Theodore Wan book, you briefly bring up Sang Huang Chi as kind of like a contemporary of Theodore's. Obviously, they're kind of doing different things, but it is
I
notable
don't
that
think it
is
was me.
oh, it wasn't you?
I don't think it was
Oh,
me.
was it not? Okay.
But as far as I know, that Hornby Island piece where he's suspended and he's reading from the Bible, right? Because his family were very religious, and he also was at that time. So that's another layer of Theodore.
Mhm.
So it really is. That's an interesting piece. I'd be interested to hear other people's analyses of that at some point as well. But to my knowledge, that's all that he did there. What I could comment on though is the images you were just showing. I put in some other. You've got some images there.
Okay, hold on. Let me bring that up. Sorry. And you
I
see
just
them
oh yeah, we've got
now.
the postcard. Only the mind is allowed to wander, which is,
Yeah.
again, this complete, not really disembodiment, really. To me, this continues that whole theme of constraints that it was in the medical photography, because if only the mind is allowed to wander, it means you're going nowhere at all. And so even though there's no medical apparatus to contain him here, the absence of light and sound is its own kind of force for containment. But it was actually another image that I was had in mind. The one
Okay,
with
which one?
the
The
silver
one.
one, the aluminum
Oh,
foil.
okay. The Mira. Yeah, here, the letter
Mirror
on aluminum
Shore.
foil.
Okay, so these images, this image from Mirror Shore, who taught at NASCAD and then went back to New York, and Theodore wrote her, and he wrote her a letter, and he typed it on aluminum foil, and so it's kind of an odd thing to do, and I did make a transcript of the letter, and so there's nothing terribly fascinating in it, though he does sign off very affectionately, "Love, Theodore." What interested me about it was what he, well, first of all, you can see Mira Shore trying to photograph this, to send me the photo. It not only is it difficult to read, but it's even more difficult to photograph. Right. So, and to my mind, this work, you could say, yes, British conceptualism. Ian Byrne did these works where he incised text into mirrors, right? To me, this is like Theodore's sense of humor. He would always make references in his work to other conceptual artists, almost as if to give it a stamp of authenticity or something. And maybe he felt it when he was at NASCAD that you always had to, quote somebody in a sense. So he does this in a very, very playful way. So this is an example of how playful he was, I think. But it's also, to my mind, it's also like a mirror. Like Mira Shore was born and raised in New York City. And when I talked to her about this, and she said, "What do you think it means, this mirroring?" And I said, "Well, it's your name, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of all." Right? And to me, that's Theodore. He was just so sharp. He never missed a beat. there's another couple of images, though, that she sent me. And the reason she sent all of this to me was because there is a second exhibition that was that I curated along with the Theodore Wan exhibition that traveled across Canada in both Halifax at Anna Leonowens and at the VAG, simultaneous with those shows, was a second exhibition where I asked about 20 odd, 30, maybe even 30 people who knew Theodore if they had anything in their personal collections that he had given them. And so I had wonderful response. This was part of it. Is there the image, it was shown previously, kind of out of context. No? Yeah, here we go. You can see this, you see this grid. This was the only painting that Theodore did during his graduate degree. Okay. And you see him with Mira Shore on the left, and there's Mira Shore and a couple of other students, and everybody's having a grand time. But then on the left, and this is out of proportion to the image on the right, this is a very much larger series of photos in front of this painting. And the painting, of course, is a reference to a very famous kind of grid system introduced by John Lamprey, who in the 19th century, and it was used as a way to measure different racial characteristics with the explicit purpose, in fact, or implicit purpose of reinforcing the superiority of the European race. Mm. And so it's interesting, Theodore is able to be quite playful in front of it with the other students. But when he makes this work, he assumes the very precise right, left, and back and forward poses that subjects of different races were asked to do, and they were photographed. This was a very early use of the medium of photography to reinforce European racial notions of European racial superiority, but by using a kind of pseudo-scientific method, which is represented by the grid. And of course, the grid also has a history in modernist painting and so forth. So the grid is both an art form that we're all familiar with, as well as this historically situated means of justifying the continuation of colonialism. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, this kind of double-sided here. But one thing that I have thought of when looking at how rigid the positions are of Theodore here is that it's very much like the constriction in those medical apparatuses. He's always subjecting himself to these rigid structures, and I can't help but feel that it was his sense of identity as someone from Hong Kong coming as a young teenager to Canada, that this was one of his chief concerns.
Thank you so much for that, Christine. And I know we're a bit over, but we have one more question from Brandon, if everybody's okay with sticking on for a little bit more, as people can, some panelists, thank you so much for your time. You can leave if you'd like, but Brandon asks, do the presenters feel like there's a level of speculation involved in talking about Theodore's work, since he seemed like a closed book, or didn't talk about his work as the presenters have said, and since his career was quite brief? And we can all anyone can sort of take this conversation or take this question.
Restate it again, Michael.
My apologies. Does anyone feel that because Theodore was a sort of a closed book, is there a level of speculation that is involved in sort of talking about his work, or what you think his intentions were with his work? And because his career was brief as well.
No, I don't know. That's an interesting question. I mean, I wrestle with that because I don't think about these things every day, obviously, but sometimes it just wells up. for any number of reasons. But I don't think anybody who makes art imagines it's a closed book. I don't know what exactly, I mean, that's a cliche expression, but I don't think it applies, because every time you look at this, anybody's work, you're in a different place in a different time. You have a different, your context is critical to the reception of the work at any moment. So you build up a series of points of contact with the work, I think. And so you share those with yourself. You share like what you thought, earlier or later, and so on and so forth. And it's also mitigated by other work that's kind of connects to it somehow, I think. So there's a very complex relationship that plays out. I don't think the idea of a closed book makes sense as a way of trying to either resolve a discussion or a point of view for a work of art.
I think that Brandon's question, maybe it was just the way that I sort of phrased it. I think Brandon, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon, but like he used the term closed book more so in terms of like talking about Theodore himself as a sort of a person, and sort of, as we were talking about, he wasn't somebody who sort of talked about his work or his intentions about his work unless he was sort of prompted to. He wasn't sort of bragging in that sort of way.
Yeah.
But yeah, your point is noted, Paul. But yeah, I just wanted to
There
sort
was
of
a
throw that in there.
tradition. Yeah, there was a tradition that artists of this particular period were also articulated what they were doing very well. In other words, they're all almost their own critic. And of course, that's exactly what I looked at when the art form would come in, and you'd see one of the most prominent art forms in 1967 is Robert Smithson having his work on the cover, the mirror edition, and then also writing about his work, eliminating the critic, and that was like something that, of course, an artist wanted to articulate their position, but at the same time didn't necessarily want to describe what the work was. I mean, Duchamp did that as well. So he didn't, though. He wasn't going to sit down and write an essay, or if he's invited to do a talk, to give a kind of critique of what he was about to do. So if that's more of of a more measured, a more, not so much controlling, but a way of not giving it all away, not showing all your cards, which I think has a much better strategy, because then you're held up to what you've said about that forever, right? I mean, if there's one work for me that shows how brilliant he was, is when he does the name change from Theodore Wan to Theodore Saskatchewan, and all the research he does, how he puts it out, the entire installation, from charting, mapping where the place is, to charting and mapping this kind of divine consummation with the female Theodora of Saskatchewan, as a kind, was so amusing and brilliant to become to actually take that another new moniker, Theodore of Saskatchewan. Also, it was so amusing, so wonderful. I don't think he was aware of Duchamp, but Duchamp was just a lot more, technical. This was so, I don't know, such a superb, funny, easy work to understand and to also see how he does it. I don't know, that's why I felt if there's something that closed, well, it was just too early, he went too early. But boy, did he, look at the work that he left, and we're still talking about it. Michael, you're still interested in it, and a lot of other people are, right? And the reconsider, I mean, that's all you can ask for as an artist, to be reconsidered. Maybe you get passed up at a particular time, but when you get reconsidered, it's just those are very special occasions, you know. Still here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's a kind of a good place to sort of wrap up. Thank you so much, Christos and Christine and Paul, so much for being part of our panel, and also for all that you've done to sort of help out with my research and with the exhibition. And I hope to see all of you fine friends soon. And thank you for everybody who's still with us, who's attending the panel right now. I'm not sure, Kathy, do you want to have anything else to say before we sort of wrap up for the day?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. I know when we met before, we were talking about this moment in art history that hasn't really been written down yet. So it was so great to witness it and to listen to it and learn more about that era in Canadian art history that not a lot of people know about. So I just want to thank you for sharing. It was great. And thank you to everyone out there for listening. And a reminder, you just have another few days to go see the show. So please, if you haven't seen Theodore's work in person yet, please come down to the Richmond Art Gallery. You have till June 30th to view the work. And otherwise, yeah, just thank you, everyone. And
a happy early birthday, Theodore, as well.
yes.
On Saturday.
Yeah.
Bye,
He's
everyone.
69 years old.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Wow.
All right. Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
Paul. Bye, Christine.
Bye.
Good night.
Paul. Bye, Paul.
Talk to everyone soon.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye.